Did God cause David to sin by numbering the people? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse by verse study of the book of 2 Samuel on walking through the Bible.
Of his word, the glory of his cross.
Today we're going to be discussing 2 Samuel chapter 24, verses 1 to 9. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 2 Samuel chapter 24, beginning at verse 1. Now the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, "Go, number Israel and Judah." So the king said to Joab the commander of the army who was with him, "Now go throughout all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, and count the people, that I may know the number of the people." And Joab said to the king, "Now may the Lord your God add to the people 100 times more than there are, and may the eyes of my lord the king see it. But why does my lord the king desire this thing?" Nevertheless, the king's word prevailed against Joab and against the captains of the army. Therefore Joab and the captains of the army went out from the presence of the king to count the people of Israel. And they crossed over the Jordan and camped at Aroer on the right side of the town, which is in the midst of the ravine of Gad, and towards Jazer. Then they came to Gilead, and to the land of Tatim Hodshai. They came to Dan Jaan, and around Sidon, and they came to the stronghold of Tyre, and all the city of the Hivites and the Canaanites. Then they went out to South Judah as far as Beersheba. So when they had gone through all the land, they came to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. Then Joab gave the sum of the number of the people to the king. And there were in Israel 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword, and the men of Judah were 500,000 men. Coming now to the last chapter of 2 Samuel, we again have events described to us that are seemingly out of order to the chronology of this book. We explained how that is not necessarily true back in lessons 51 and 52 of this series, so for a more detailed explanation on that, we invite you to go back and listen to those lessons. Based on its placement, on the placement of this event in the book of 1 Chronicles, we surmise that it probably took place close to the events of chapter 12, after David had defeated the Ammonites, and also after the events with the Gibeonites, and then later the Philistine giants. The other reason we can conclude this is because the chapter begins with, "Again, the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel." When it comes to David's sin with Bathsheba, the anger of the Lord was aroused against David, but not Israel. However, when it came to the issue with the Gibeonites, the Lord's anger was aroused against the entire nation for breaking their treaty against the Gibeonites. And so, by saying "again" in verse 1 of this chapter, it appears that the events here came after the events with the Gibeonites. Now, verse 1 has confused a lot of people and actually caused scoffers of the Bible to accuse it of a contradiction here, for it appears to say that the Lord's anger was aroused against Israel, and so he got David to number the people, and then punished David for doing so. The reason why Bible scoffers charge the Bible with a contradiction is because in the retelling of this event in 1 Chronicles, listen to what 1 Chronicles 21 verse 1 says. "Now Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel." So the charge often goes, who incited David to take the census, God or Satan? But this charge made against the Bible is another one of those times where Jesus' response to the Sadducees is apt, which is that these people do err, not knowing the Scriptures. First, James 1:13 tells us that God does not tempt man to sin. But even though this is true, God does allow Satan to tempt man to sin. We see this at the beginning of the book of Job, where God allowed Satan to afflict Job, with Satan thinking that if he did so, Job would curse God. Of course, Satan was proven wrong, for Job's faith in God carried him through. Perhaps that is something similar to what is going on here. God was angry with Israel, for what reason we do not know, other than Israel must have fallen into sin again, and so God allowed Satan to tempt David to sin. And to the Hebrews of David's day, around the time when the book of 2 Samuel was written, They often viewed actions that the Lord permitted as coming from the Lord, even though not directly, as we saw with Shimei cursing David back in 2 Samuel 16:10 and 11. By the time 1 Chronicles was written, though, that nuanced view had obviously been refined to the acknowledgement that God does not tempt man to sin, but does allow Satan to tempt man to sin. Now, the writer of 1 Samuel, by framing the event as being from the Lord, is not charging God with sin by allowing Satan to do this, for God did not cause David to sin. He is just speaking as the people spoke in that day, something that God has always allowed his inspired writers to do when speaking to his people. 1 Chronicles clarifies for the Hebrews of Ezra's day, though, that this census was not taken at God's direct command, but through Satan's temptation, a temptation that God allowed to occur but did not cause. But unlike it was with Job, who did not sin under the temptations of Satan, David did. The question is, how did David sin? Many commentators point to Exodus 30, verses 11 to 16, where God commanded Moses that when he took the census of Israel, ransom money was to be paid. And thus, they say that since David did not have Israel pay this ransom money, that is how David sinned, because the ransom money was to direct Israel to realize their need for God's redemption. And while this sounds good on the surface, if this was the sin, why was Joab's response to David's command to number the people that taking this census in and of itself was not wrong in that situation, and not simply tell David that he needed to ensure the ransom money was paid? And why didn't David, once his conscience condemned him of sin, simply have the ransom money paid to God with the required penalty added as restitution for this sin, as would be done for the trespass offering? From the text itself, it does not appear that simply not having the ransom money paid was the sin, but rather the census itself. But why would this be? For we have never read in Scripture where God told Israel that it was necessarily sinful to number the people, for God had Moses do so on 2 occasions in the book of Numbers, and we've seen on numerous occasions the number of troops that went into battle against the enemy mentioned, which would necessarily require them to be counted. So if the literal counting part wasn't the sin, what was? Here is where the positioning of this census in the book of 1 Chronicles might give us some clues, for in that book it is placed right after David's victories against the Philistine giants. After these victories, which also came after David's victories against the Moabites, the Edomites, the Syrians, and the Ammonites, it appears that David was beginning to be puffed up with pride. This is implied in Joab's comments to David in verse 3, where he said, "Now may the Lord your God add to the people 100 times more than they are, and may the eyes of my lord the king see it. But why does my lord the king desire this thing?" Joab asked why David wanted to know how many people there were in Israel. God hadn't commanded it. Joab said that the Lord could add as many people as needed for Israel to remain in their land. What was David's motivation? It appears to be pride. During David's reign, Israel's territory and influence had grown to heights it had never seen. And instead of relying on God to keep this territory secure for Israel, David wanted to know that he could militarily do so. And then, of course, it is possible that these numbers might also assist David if he wanted to raise more taxes for himself, for he would now know how many people in Israel there were. And if this is another motivation for the census, it shows us David's covetousness in this matter too. It was these types of weaknesses in David's heart, which we know existed after his sin with Bathsheba, that Satan used to tempt David. And David gave in to those temptations and sinned by having Joab number the people. It took Joab almost 10 months to number the people, for they had to start east of the Jordan in Arar, in the tribe of Reuben, and go north into Gilead and the tribes of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh, before crossing over again at Dan in the north, counting all the people up there, ultimately moving south until they came to the southern borders of Judah, which are often denoted as being Beersheba in the south, even though Judah's territory at times stretched further south than this, especially during the kingdoms of David and Solomon. And how many fighting men were in Israel, usually denoted as those 20-year-olds and above? In Israel, the northern tribes, there were 800,000, and in Judah, 500,000, for a total of 1.3 million. Recall from Numbers that when Israel left Egypt, their army totaled 603,500 men, which means that in the intervening 400 years, Israel's military might had almost doubled, likely yielding us a total population of about 4 to 6 million by this point. It wasn't until hearing this number that David's conscience convicted him of sin, something we'll cover, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 2 Samuel chapter 24, verses 10 to 17, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.